Now, very different issue now, indeed. There's a new documentary about to air in Britain about the fattest man in the world. And yes, he's British. But we do hear that our own, very own Libby Davies MP is trying to take back the record for Canada. Anyway, Keith Mann weighs more than 800 pounds, and it cost the British public about $80,000 for more than a dozen people to care for him, to keep him alive. The same applies to big fatties in Canada. And why is it also that so many people who are involved in anti-poverty and social justice marches and movements are also overweight? So, Cathy Shaidle is the evil genius behind the superb and essential blog 5 Feet of Fury, and she's svelte, slim. What are you, 90 pounds, if that?
I wish. That was years ago.
Really?
I wish. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I carry a little bit of, I could lose a good 30 pounds.
We're both getting a little older.
Well, yeah, we are. Now, but I mean, this guy, and it's not this guy itself. Actually, can we see a photo of him? Can we put a photo of him up on the screen now? Because people need to know just how sexy he is. So that's, there he is, big boned, big bone, that's all it is. I'm sure it's genetic. Here's my problem, and there are apparently hundreds of people like this in Canada. Yeah. They don't leave the room, they don't leave the bed most of the time. Who brings them the food?
That's the good question, isn't it? I mean, I don't mind someone being this way, really, on their own dime. I'm old enough to remember when you would read the Guinness Book of Records, and they had a guy, and he weighed about 900 pounds. He was the fattest man, and everyone went, woo. Yeah. And now, if you saw him today in the mall, you'd think, whatever.
Well, you wouldn't see him in the mall because he can't get out of the house at 900 pounds.
And if people want to do something like that on their own dime, I can't object. But I object when people, are paying basically for this guy to have his life, so to speak. It's not really much of a life, I understand.
Well, if somebody gives drugs to an addict, we say, how could you have done such a thing?
Unless you're in British Columbia.
Yes, exactly. Or you're a friend of Whitney Houston.
That's right.
And then, but in this case, it's not overeating slightly. You look at the breakfast, it's 14 hot dogs and quite a lot of money involved. So where does the money come from? Because they can't work.
Oh, absolutely.
I assume a lot are on social assistance, welfare. Yes. And then there are people going out to buy the food. So that's the problem. And then we have all these caregivers. Right. And this man has, 7 full-time and 7 or 8 others who are part-time. And in Canada, we know of the cases, and it's all over, from coast to coast, people like this. And there are many of them. And we never have the authorities saying, well, I'm afraid we can't help you. No, they can't allow someone to die, but it's not like you've cancer or...
Exactly.
I mean, you're effectively killing yourself slowly.
Exactly. And what always gets to me is those inevitable stories where they send the 10 firefighters over to break the guy out of his home. And at the risk of sounding like a poor imitation of Mark Stein, it's such a metaphor for the West today. The last real heroes, the last fit, manly men are dispatched to help this rather parasitical, useless person, and it just, like, what have we come to? Can you imagine this 30 years ago or 40 years ago? There weren't people like this, were there?
Well, there weren't. There was Daniel Lambert, I think his name was, from Leicestershire, because there used to be a picture of him in the National Portrait Gallery in London. He was in the 18th century, and he was the fattest man then.
And he was probably 300 pounds.
No, 300, please. No, he was still up there, 600-700 pounds. But at least he did the right thing. He became a circus act. He would go to the circus and people would you like to see Daniel Lambert, fattest man in England? And they would say, I would. I sound like Oliver Twist. And they would give their shilling or their groat, and they would go in and say, oh, look.
Well, yes, there was a time in living memory where the only time you could see people who are the size of the people in the shopping malls was if you went to the sideshow. But interestingly, the same do-gooders who insisted that those sideshows be, cut back often are, the most scolding about the obesity epidemic. Right. But they also want people like this to have free food. I just don't understand it.
Let's
talk
about obesity epidemic. Right. And I mean, made some jokes, and I'm sure we'll be taken to all sorts of authorities for making jokes like that. As we speak, there are people starving to death. There are women in Africa who see their babies die of starvation. Yes. And I get a bit sick and tired of people in the West saying, it's difficult for me, and it's genetic, and I have this. No, most people, the vast majority of people, they're overweight. I'm probably 30 pounds overweight because I eat too much. When I go to the gym and I cut down, I just shrink. It's quite amazing.
It's a miracle.
Exactly. There aren't that many. Obesity is not a major issue in Zambia or Tanzania
or Zimbabwe.
It's a first world problem. Of course it is. And you've pointed out very well on your blog that some of these marches and demonstrations and protests in the United States in particular, but Canada too,
Yes.
about poverty and injustice. And these guys are sort of holding their bellies as they walk along saying, we want more.
And people will say to you, well, you don't understand. You see, poor people can only afford to buy starches, and starches are fattening. But if people go to Reason Magazine online and Google obesity myths, you'll see that there have been many, many studies showing.
Give that site again.
It's Reason Magazine.
Reason Magazine.
And they did a wonderful debunking of all these myths about obesity and how there are more McDonald's in poor neighborhoods. None of that is actually true. It's just one of those social workers, please keep me employed myths. I'm not unsympathetic. I've gone from a size 0 to a 14 and back again twice in my life.
I don't know what that means, but it sounds very impressive.
Well, I use the sizes, not the weight, because it sounds a little better. One was for medical reasons.
Yeah, of course.
Prednisone will do that to you.
Yeah.
The other was I quit smoking and met my future husband with the sweet tooth. That was my fault.
Blame a man.
And, you know, and that was my fault.
Yeah.
And then I had to lose the weight. And you know, even if it is genetic, I mean, alcoholism can be called genetic too, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to sit there drinking.
You can have a
all day.
tendency. I mean, well, I suppose many years ago I went out with long before I met my wonderful wife, with an Irish girl who, and her alcoholism had been. Well, no, I mean, it's not all, but in her family that there was a tendency,
yes.
and she had inherited a tendency towards the possibility of alcoholism. I understand that,
Absolutely.
but food is different. New Orleans, what happened down there, and we saw. I mean, it was just the common morbid obesity of people saying, why don't you help us? Why won't you give us more food? And it's hard to accept that.
Yes, and again, you know, the sight of these physically fit, young men in the armed forces going to help these people was just one of those, to me, tragic photographs of where we're all going and what we're kind of descending into. And it was dreadful on 100 different levels.
Right.
I don't understand it. But again, on your dime, fine. But the people of New Orleans normally weren't doing it on their dime.
Okay, can I just have the camera for a moment here? I need to make a plea before we do go to the commercial break. If you were in any way offended by anything we said, please write to the head of the CBC and tell him. Kathy, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.